Those of you who were here last week will recall that we ended with two myths of origin, each of them giving us some sort of GPS fix on our own situation in a still very violent and violence-haunted world. There was the story of temptation and fall, given as framing prologue to the salvation history of Israel in the Bible. And then there was the postmodern myth of our fast globalizing, multicultural, interfaith societies brought to us in glorious technicolor in the recent film, adapted from the novel, The Life of Pi. Both these myths are, in some sense, myths of violent origin. They problematize, and in part they already answer, the strategic and crucial question, where does violence come from? What are its origins and causes? Genesis replies, it's a form of ersatz sacrality, a form of false or idolatrous transcendence, born of man's attempt to imitate and to outdo the Creator God. It's a form, and certainly it's a symptom and a sign of the constitutional human exile from true harmony with God. The exile or estrangement known in Christian theological tradition as original sin. We heard about that. And it's a pointer to the disasters of murder, of cultural and cosmic disorder that immediately in the book of Genesis illustrate the meaning of that exile. The other postmodern myth, the one that still has to be written up, you'll remember, in book form, replies, violence, that's the thing we wake up next to right there in the lifeboat beside us. It's the tiger, both in ourselves and other animals, and in the cosmic forces of nature around us. It's the beautiful and dangerous beast, which on anybody's account shares with us our fragile human attempts at salvation, leastways at survival, adrift as we all are on the cosmic ocean of sentient life in this vast and enigmatic cosmos. The Life of Pi is specifically a post-Darwinian myth. Human violence is discovered first of all through its roots in animal violence, which in turn seems to be derived from violence discerned in the primordial forces of cosmic nature. In the film, that's the fire that destroys the zoo, and it's the devastating ocean storm which initiates the adventure of shipwreck and lifeboat survival. Do you remember those sinkholes we noticed as a crucial feature of the uprooted miniature island refuge floating somewhere in mid-Pacific? They communicate still with the primordial ocean depths. They're shafts of insight and profundity, reaching down towards mysteries of origin. At least they have that value as far as the onward travelling boy is concerned. But they no longer perform that function for the mass of marooned secular meerkats who cluster chattering around the sinkholes but never jump in, unlike the boy. In today's lecture, I do hope to jump in and dive down. I'll try to do some sinkhole exploring, as it were, and to see what we can see of the ocean depths in the expert company of evolutionary submariner and fundamental anthropologist René Girard. He is the modern theorist who does most, I feel, to answer the aspiration present in both myths to mind the gap of spiritual exile, the gap of postmodern uprootedness, of fragmented coherence and fractured wholeness in the life of Pi. Girard, I will suggest, shows us how to get the problem of sacred violence into sharp and unitary focus, thus enabling us to come most profoundly to grips with the tiger. I shall make three moves in arguing this case. I'll say something firstly by way of introducing mimetic theory, that is the theory in which is embedded René Girard's approach to the foundational complicity of violence and the sacred. I'll come then to the original scene he envisages, the basic modelling scenario of founding murder, which his theory posits. Thirdly, I'll say something about how this Girardian modelling of origins offers to unlock the still very little understood enigma of hominization and the beginnings of human culture and civilization. That will open the account of what I've called the foundational complicity of violence and the sacred. And it will, I hope, help us turn around the problem of sacred violence, which is still extant today. Why is mimetic theory so called? Well, because it refers centrally to the notion of mimesis. That's the Greek word for imitation. It was Aristotle, very early on in human thought, who glimpsed from afar that what distinguishes humankind from animals isn't so much the superior skills and higher faculties, it is rather the faculty of imitation. He didn't fully grasp or fully develop the potential of that idea. He couldn't do so because he had no notion that the human species actually does stand in line of Darwinian descent from animals. And he was a prisoner of a limiting idea, which we ourselves frequently share, namely that imitation is a relatively second-rate sort of asset, mere imitation, as we often say. We can see what Aristotle means by that. He's thinking of mimicry or parody, those particular forms of imitation which can indeed appear more derivative or secondary. But now look at the very different way Gifford himself develops the same notion of imitation. Imagine, he says, a 3 or 4 year old child introduced into a room, rather like a Hamble's toy store, filled with gorgeous toys of all shapes and sizes, within which there is, however, already installed another child who is already playing with an already chosen toy. Which toy then, in this whole fairy palace of toys, will the new child desire to play with? Without thinking, we all know the answer to that question. He will want precisely the toy the other child is already playing with. Now, why is that? It's because he is attuned immediately and fundamentally to reading the desire of the other child, so that the first child's preference, to which he locks on, as we say, becomes the highlighted model for his own preference. He wants most determinedly what the other child wants, and so he is imitating not just the latter's externally visible gestures and behaviour, but also his inward and entirely invisible desire. He's reproducing the other child's estimate of value. Wow, great toy. And his intentional goal, I must have it. Now, you heard Gifford say that was his great insight, and I believe it is. In human beings, there is an amazing and profoundly defining aptitude for group intelligence, founded on mimesis. We are built by evolution to represent, empathize with, replicate, and even return to sender any and all forms of stimulus, behaviour, or attitude. We copy in reciprocity. I hold out my hand, you hold out yours. And what we read and decipher, first of all, is one another's desire. What makes us the most social, the most highly collaborating species in nature, and more than anything else, that's the secret of our evolutionary success. Mimesis creates the very possibility of human reciprocities, of human relationalities of whatever kind. What is the first thing a newborn child does? Apart, I mean, from the things other animals also do, like suckling, excreting, sleeping, crying, and so on. We all know the answer to that question too, but how many of us have actually seen how wondrously novel and prodigiously significant it is? The mother smiles. Her child smiles back. Research on the neurobiology of imitation has shown how this reaction is produced. It's produced by the firing of what are now called mirror neurons in the frontal cortex of the brain. That's a characteristically human response. And, notice, it's something much more immediate and basic than a learned reaction or a rational, calculating one. Something akin, perhaps, to group electricity in pre-human animals, to the instinctive mirroring which allows huge shoals of fish, for instance, to flicker and turn as one, in unison, so as to confuse predators, and which allows the octopus to change colour to match the seabed onto which it subsides, or the lyrebird to mimic any and every bird in the Australian forest. It's this faculty of mimesis that enables the higher primates to evolve the most basic systems of communication, to interiorize learned models of behavior, so for instance tool use in crows or in chimps, and to respect certain proto-cultural norms like dominance patterns in animal communities. You little monkey, we say to our children when they infuriate or delight us by replicating adult tricks, expressions, manners or mannerisms. But we now know something that passed Aristotle by, namely that animals are not that good at imitation. Whereas human imitation is immeasurably more sophisticated and developed, diverse in system, and above all, more freighted with consequence than is the case in even our nearest pre-human evolutionary relatives. Animals, that is, pre-human animals, do imitate each other, certainly, in learning certain basic skills, in reproducing basic group emotions like hostility or fear, or basic behaviours like the fight or flight instinct. But when they fight their own kind, however, full mimesis, that's to say mutually imitating reciprocity, barely comes into it. There's no supervolting tit for tat in their combat. They're contending merely for what they need in order to survive: territory, mates, food, and so on. And that means that animals of the same species fight to the death only very rarely. It's an accident, an exception when it happens. Human imitation is more intimate and complicated. We enter imaginatively into the inner world of other humans. We desire things because we see someone else desiring them. We're interested in their interest. That turns us on, as we say, and makes those things desirable to us. What is fashion but novelty made desirable and imitated? What is advertising except the proposing and manipulation of models of desire? What is a market except a place of exchange subject to judgments of desirability, which are then copied? New York sneezes and London catches cold. Mimesis all. Do you copy that, Red Leader? Yes, of course he does. We all do. When we learn anything or communicate anything, we interiorize and replicate inwardly the message or the meaning or the model in the very process of taking it on board, the process of making it ours. And the human world would fall apart if we didn't. Yes, we copy other people's desire, but here's the thing. That immediately means two hands reaching out in rivalry for the same object, and very soon mobilizing incrementally, and coming then into conflict, becoming mimetic even in their rivalry, in that tit-for-tat retaliation, and in that process mobilizing the entire psychic energy and resource of each antagonist, even to the point of sacrificing life itself. Witness the suicide bomber. And on the way, or subsequently, mobilizing also in a sort of mimetic chain reaction the energies of all our allies and all their allies. Witness the mimetic fascination of the jihad. To understand in Girardian terms this latter phenomenon, which concerns us so much just now, you simply have to factor in that further multiplier of mimetic effect supplied by the peculiar conditions of electronic internet communication, and no doubt also some traditional factors of identity politics, such as the assertiveness and the paranoia of displaced and alienated minorities. And then there's the peculiarly electrifying effect produced within an Islamic culture sphere of the declaration of the caliphate. Most of us don't realise what that represents for Muslims. We shall certainly find that the dynamic of mimetic rivalry is built in from the beginning to any adequate reading of the geopolitical context within which ISIL arises and develops. So I'm saying that mimetic theory is an excellent tool for analysing that sort of phenomenon. At all events, mimetic fascination always locks us into that rivalry and that conflict. Rivalry itself becomes mirror-like and fascinating. It takes us over entirely with a dynamic all of its own, which is obscurely compelling, to the extent, we have said, of leading some to deliberately sacrifice their own life to the sacred cause. This is just one outcome, but it alerts us to something more general, which is that we forget, when caught in this dynamic, we forget the limited state for which we had begun to contend or fight in the first place. What takes over in the end, but it's always been implicitly present from the beginning, is, Girard insists, something metaphysical, the pure assertion of our own identity as such, rivaling with and threatened by some other identity. That hidden cause and origin is by definition sacred. That's to say, it's absolute, it's non-negotiable, it's that on which we stand, towards which we tend. At least that is the case within the first framing context provided by evolutionary survival. Right? That proviso is rather crucial, and it provides me with the whole of the second half of this lecture series, because there are other framing contexts which we shall look at. But there's another consequence. In mimetic violence, antagonists who once wanted only to be their own distinct selves become monstrous doubles of each other, strange twins, as it were, locked together and made indistinguishable from each other by retaliatory acts, verbal, imaginary, and then actual physical violence. Already in Girard's very first work on desire in the European model, this negative electricity of conflict and undifferentiation, that's to say the loss of difference, sparks and crackles. The Girardian triangle of mimetic desire, that's the shape traced out by the relations between the subject, the object of desire, and the mediating adversary other, spins wildly on its axis, and it's shown to morph as it does so into various forms of black hole, capable of decisively warping social space. So our mimetic rivalries, the conflicts that result from them, and the violence that results from those conflicts are a huge and considerable factor when you consider how human beings live together and the history of that existence. To that basic structure of negative reciprocity, that mutual other-imitating rivalry, Girard then adds an account of its dynamic quality. Why is it so powerful? Why does it develop? Why is it part of an ever more violent crescendo? The conflictual charge of mimetic rivalry in humans will tend to increase exponentially, and it will become contagious externally, catching up and drawing in third parties precisely because it engages throughout the whole social field a sort of reciprocal mimesis, that great and unseen multiplier of desire. Now, in the end, we can see that we're being asked to grasp something truly momentous. There is an unsuspected runaway dynamic at work in human affairs, those black holes of violence, let's say feud, vendetta, crusade, ISIS, will tend fatefully to deepen, proliferate and fuse, thus drawing into conflict and violence all relationalities within a given community. Now think about that in relation to our fast globalizing world community as we're beginning to aspire to create it today. Isn't that what we most fear about jihad? That it will suck in all members of the worldwide Islamic community. That's the nightmare labelled clash of civilizations. And isn't it the strategy of ISIL to provoke just precisely that apocalyptic paroxysm? Any human grouping, local or worldwide, in fact, is subject, visibly or invisibly, to an extreme peril of violent implosions, from which it also follows, in all deductive rigour, that containing or managing self-generated human violence must be the prime possibility condition and the number one imperative of human social life at all times and in all places. Here's a radically new and disturbing take on what anthropologists are accustomed to call group intelligence in humans, human sociality, if you like. It represents the obverse face of human superiority in nature, as gifted to us by evolution. Here is the peril that answers human potential, its apocalyptic shadow side. That's why we're worried, and if we know ourselves, that's what we should worry about. I can't, in the time available to us here tonight, take you down the exact path that leads Girard from his general insights of mimetic theory to his precise scenario of original founding murder. It's a path of hypothesizing, modelling and confirmation that passes through the study of Greek tragedy, through the anthropology of primitive religions and of world mythologies. But I can give you a vivid, imaginative glimpse of the type of scenario of origin which Girard increasingly envisages. It appears, and Girard himself acknowledges this precursor sketch, in the climactic scene of William Golding's novel Lord of the Flies. I circulated the text last week, and I don't know how many of you have actually read that? Oh, you have. Thank you very much. That's enough. If you haven't, I have a few extra copies here, which you might like to collect now or later. So I'll go straight on then, if I may. What is Golding suggesting to us in this text? Fundamentally, that violence is an evolutionary legacy and a reversion to primitive patterns programmed into us by our evolutionary past. How so? Well, look at the behaviour to which the hunters regress. The hunters, first of all. By reason of evolutionary provenance, man is a carnivore, hence also a violent predator. Evolutionary biologists will tell you meat eating is precisely associated with the growth spurt involved in that emergence which we call hominization. The larger, more complex human brain required the richest proteins. Predation, in which Homo sapiens shares, assures our survival, and it underlies our higher development and flourishing. Add to that the uniquely human turbo of mimetic and rivalrous desire, the peculiarly human phenomenon we have just examined, with its contagious and incremental dynamics, and you will begin to see why humans are super violent, why we are nature's ultimate tigers. Now look at the hunting dance. This is a form of mimetic behaviour with precisely a runaway dynamic of crescendo towards paroxysm. Normally, for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, the hunting dance would mimic the animal tract. Here the pig actually hunted. The animal is conjured up in order to summon up the power of the group over it in anticipation of the hunt. But the dance called for here by Jack, the leader of the hunters, become lord of the dance, is a variant form of that standard ritual. It's performed by all of his tribe to ward off everything they fear, not just the hunted animal, but also the darkness and the whole awesome power of cosmic nature, the baleful will of the heavens over them. The threat of the sky is Golding's expression. It's that larger, unnameable dread which they project onto their imaginary adversary, the beast. You see Golding's point. This is a form of exorcism and or propitiation. Those are the words we need to understand archaic religion, especially where it involves blood sacrifice. Exorcism of that awesome dread. Propitiation of the cosmic violence of the storm. Look at Golding's emphasis on the whip of the lightning flashes, the blows of thunder. Propitiated actually, and in fact, supposed author of those whip blows, since without knowing it, the terrified boys are projecting into the heavens a monstrous double born out of their own inner spiritual violence and torment. The dance is undertaken, we see clearly, to process and manage their own obscure collective distress. Its effect will be to distill and cook up, by mimetic contagion, their sense of the sacred. They enter into a self-induced frenzy or trance, generating the most basic feelings of unanimity and group power through the music, chanting, rhythm, and movement, circling, stamping. And the ritual becomes, in its climax, a form of runaway violence. Golding shows us a mob beating or lynching of the adversary who eerily materializes out of the darkness and stumbles into their citadel or circle. That circle, which is also, we notice, compared tellingly to a mouth, complete with a tearing of teeth and claws. Yes, suggests Golding, the boys collectively have become, and as the crescendo of the dance reaches its apex, they actually are the beast, the other, the imaginary other that they most fear. You can see how that dancing circle forms a demented but partially secure society. Quote, how the boys are protected by, quote, the fence that hemmed in the terror and made it governable. But look too at how their trance and its violence are cognitively and morally blind. In their frenzy, they kill without knowing it. Not an animal, but a fellow schoolboy who appears where they expect the beast to appear out of the dark forest. Him. You've heard of wish fulfillment. This is dread fulfillment. Self-fulfilling, nameless, inarticulate dread. What Girardian things should we take from this scene? Human violence is at bottom a mimetic phenomenon, a fascinated and fearful mirroring of the other. It is originally and always, somewhere deep down, sacred violence, despite its apparently casual or merely expedient or instrumental later developments and forms. Still today, human violence is sacralizing in at least two important senses. Negatively, first of all, it demonizes its other. And then, also positively, it is self-sacralizing. Positively, it divinizes itself. Always, it is sacrificial, requiring its victim, and actually or potentially bloody. It's also dynamic, and that dynamism, marshalling all our resources, is obscurely sexual. It rises to a climax, which must have orgasmic relief in killing, in spilling blood. Violence is violation. We talk, don't we, about bloodlust, and we recognize its presence in the sex orgies and the child sacrifice featuring in primitive religions, including in the Bible, the rites practiced among the Canaanite tribes surrounding Israel. And notice finally the self-mystification involved in this scene of originary violence and the irony it generates. Simon has come precisely to deliver the hunters from the superstitious dread that haunts and mystifies them. And what do? They kill him. They themselves exhibit the truth that the transcendent and baleful adversary they fear is in fact a monstrous double of themselves, because they themselves project heavenwards their own collective violence. In the language of Luke's Gospel, they know not what they do. That's a word about human unknowing in general, but most especially it's about human violence. It points to a grievous and harmful self-mystification, and ultimately to a human misrecognition of God. Do we begin to see the pattern of Christian allusions in this passage? Who is killed? Simon, the Jewish prophet? Simon, the deliverer, a Messiah figure therefore. Simon, the scapegoat victim of a collective lynching. This is a sort of crucifixion, recalling the dead man on a hill who is made to pay for that blind frenzy which requires its victim, its blood sacrifice. Simon is also, we note, recognized by the cosmos as a poetic kind of endorsement as the universe reclaims its own, its emissary victim, its prophet, its Messiah. This is, of course, a muted or diminished echo of the resurrection. Muted either because Golding doesn't believe in that element of the Christian story, or because he doesn't believe that 1950s Britain still believes it, or else because he wants to show that this group has slipped back precisely to a stage of human development before and below the threshold of Christian revelation. And that would be the most Girardian reading of Golding's text. So Golding gives us, acknowledged by Girard, a sort of prefiguration of the sacred violence of origins. Now let's come to Girard's own scenario of founding murder. This is a careful structuralist reconstruction, or reduction, that's a technical word, of the same sort of process as envisaged by Golding. But we shall see that Girard distinguishes profitably two things that Golding conflates, or at least doesn't distinguish. On the one hand, spontaneous founding murder. On the other, the ritual repetition of that first and founding act in the form of human ritual, human blood sacrifice. Let me now recall then what most people, if they've encountered Girard at all, probably know of him. This is the classic exposition of Girard's theory. At the threshold of hominization, that's the point of evolution when the species Homo sapiens sapiens becomes fully formed biologically and stabilized in that definition. The characteristic scenario of founding murder is regularly played out. Please notice the word regularly. This isn't any sort of one-off. It's a scenario played out with variations and developments, perhaps over tens of thousands of years. A scenario perhaps still developing. There's a paroxysm of violence. René Girard calls it the mimetic crisis. This is diffused in extremis by the very fail-safe mechanism which inaugurated historically and still, in large measure, secretly undergirds all social life and everything we call culture. The fail-safe mechanism involves a victimary process, a scapegoat murder, where the adversaries within a conflicted social group community originally wanted diverse things: to appropriate the same woman, to seize food or territory, or power, to exact retributive justice, and so on. They end up polarized, quite irrationally, upon a single adversary, arbitrarily designated to the common fury by a single rage-modelling leader. In other words, each gathering crisis of generalized violence tends to simplify at its apex into a polarized and unanimous antagonism of the type all against one. The collective blood rage is at this point deflected outwards and is discharged against a single, arbitrarily chosen and consequently quite innocent victim. The scapegoat, in fact, acts, you heard me say this, as a sort of lightning conductor to all the violently destructive energies gathered within the community. The mechanism of emissary victimization may be compared to a disjunctor switch that breaks the circuit and prevents the perilous electricity of mimetic and rivalrous desire from consuming the human house. It also sets up the first equation of collective identity bonding. Very disturbing equation, albeit strangely familiar to us from its long echoes in all societies and all periods of history. All are one against and by virtue of the rejected and scapegoated other. Then something quite remarkable happens. Girard asks us to imagine the victim, slain victim, lying inert before the hushed group of hominids or primitive men. He, she, appears simultaneously and contradictorily as the guilty origin of the crisis. She must have been guilty, or we wouldn't have killed her, nor would we have peace through her death. And two, as the beneficent provider of the miracle of renewed peace and social harmony. This moment of conflicting persuasions and surpassing awe is the beginning of a process of sacralization. The dead victim will come to be seen as the potent bearer of a power of life and death, and then as the power capable of reversing the current of life energies from negative to positive. Such terrible wrath, such amazing beneficence. The first perception will suggest in retrospect, as it comes to be deciphered collectively, that the sacrificial victim must surely have willed her own death. The second, once the corpse has been disposed of in the distance, will come to suggest that this exceptional and departed visitor must indeed have been the divinity in disguise. And the departed victim becomes then the attributed origin of all the prohibitions and rituals instituted by the group to prevent a recurrence of the same crisis. What does this scenario of founding murder add to Golding? Well, it shakes up decisively our view of human origins and of ourselves. It suggests, first of all, that humankind is, collectively speaking, as a species, a super-rivalrous, super-conflicted and super-violent animal, and then consequently and necessarily that it is the sacralizing animal whose cultural invention derives from the need to contain, control and manage his own violent shadow. Girard actually accounts here for the birth of human culture as a function of the invention of natural religion, or the archaic sacred, as he calls it, sometimes just the sacred. Ouch, but also wow. More remarkably still, the possession of this hermeneutical key, this key of interpretation, enables Girard to decipher in turn the functional logic of the principal components of the entire system of primitive religion and culture. That's to say, the most fundamental elements, factors, vectors of identity bonding, such as shared prohibition, taboo, interdict, shared ritual, in particular ritual sacrifice, shared moral codes, laws, institutions, political practices. In fact, the hermeneutical key enables, the golden key enables Girard to unlock all the stalled decipherments of Victorian anthropology. James Fraser, Robertson Smith, all that bunch. And you heard Girard say that, the first thing he said. I completed a program, the anthropological program, which other people abandoned because they said it couldn't be done. So, René Girard's scenario is founding in a very, very strong sense that it enables and brings into being everything that follows from it. Cultural invention, social order, civilization. Take ritual blood sacrifice, the Aztecs, the binding of Isaac. What's all that about? It is at the heart of the common life a reenactment or replay of the founding murder itself. The ritual slaughter of a surrogate victim replicates as exactly as possible. Here's another brilliant Girardian leap, the original scapegoat murder, with the arrière-pensée, the unformulated idea at the back of your head of recreating its cathartic, reconciling, identity bonding outcome. The victim is chosen, often from a purpose-specific reserve, as was the case, as we know, of the Aztecs, from among the marginal, the weak, or the vulnerable. So children, the sick, prisoners of war, and so on. This rite is triggered by the incipient signs of returning mimetic crisis. These are actually laid out, they are prepared and indeed solicited, and certainly enacted, in the institution of carnival, which significantly frames the sacrifice. The sacrificial climax of the festival, the carnival, exorcises and resolves once more this staged renaissance of violent contagion and conflict, but this time ritually, which is to say, repeatably. The rite's collective, strongly participatory and essentially theatrical character comes to be ceremonially regulated, aesthetically enhanced over time, delivering, no doubt, a spellbinding potency of emotional charge. We have a good idea of this from the later homologies of theme and the effective echoes it finds in Greek tragedy. Greek tragedy is actually derived from ritual sacrifice. And one of the most interesting things about Girard's theory is it does elucidate that connection. Reading Honesia, we grasp a suddenly evident and deeply sobering fact that the entire panoply of cultural invention engendering civilized societies, including moral codes, religions, laws, social and political institutions and practices, is at least originally and elementarily, that qualification being clearly a weighty one, derived from primitive prohibitions, ritual practice and myth. Such inventions rationalize and refine, and they still do that today, and still mythically very often, the same underlying logic of the violent control of violence by symbolic and ritual means. Talk about things hidden. One of the greatest things we don't know, of course, is how Homo sapiens sapiens came to emerge as a species, in continuity with the animal world, yes, but increasingly caught in a quantum leap of distinction and difference through the development of what we call culture, which is simply hyper-developed, codified, and generationally transmitted group intelligence. I can't much go into that. I hope you'll read the classic statement of Girard's theory, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. I'll explore that title actually next week. It's even more surprising than you might imagine, and you'll begin to see why the modern, that's to say the non-post-archaic world, is born out of Christianity. There you really begin to see something which is fascinating. Are those hidden things important? Well, put it this way. When anthropologists of human origins pick up the telling of the evolutionary tale, they're in general deeply reluctant to give the peril of human violence any nodal or originary place in their scenarios of origin. And yet that's the place we ought to anticipate and predict that it will have if Darwin's theory of the descent of man is broadly correct. The only struggle or jihad that they imagine is with the environment and with deficient technologies. They're apt to think of human culture as based on a social contract, Husserl, hammered out rationally between consenting modern adults. They project backwards the gains of rational actor theory, which they derive from modern boardrooms and committee rooms. Right? So they project that back, and they imagine that the primitive man acted rationally out of self-interest, and the chances of that being true are basically nil. Perhaps that's why they and we are always so indignantly surprised when fundamentalist groups such as ISIL reenact today the same real scenarios of origin: armed violence wreaking apocalyptic devastation, a sacralized moral and legal order, heard of Sharia law, imposed in the name of God, as are also the enslavement, sacrificial beheadings, crucifixions, and other forms of exclusionary violence against all who stand outside and against the mimetic unanimity of their sacred or sacral bond. But we can see here clearly enough that religious fundamentalism, when it's radicalized and violent, is a regression to the archaic sacral first form of human social bonding and the first form of religion. If you can glimpse those implications, then, like me, you're likely to be saying to Girard, wow. So what in sum does René Girard mean by founding murder? Primary sense, spontaneous, prototypical lynching of scapegoat victim, setting in train the birth of a specifically human culture and providing the conditions of its establishment. Founding murder, we might say, recapitulatively, is the art of violence contained by a selective, exemplary, therapeutic dose of violence. It cut short its but contained at a cost. On the one hand, founding murder limits the contagion of violence. It cuts short its overt ascendancy within the community. Yet at the same time, the practice of emissary violence is secretly interiorized within the group. It becomes naturalized, recycled, diffused throughout the whole sphere of its systems, works and ways. And the more effectively, since that founding act is articulated indissolubly to a consecrating sacralization. The sacred functions, of course, in the imaginary and symbolic orders, but with irradiating effects in the real world. That's why I compared it in the first lecture to dark matter. Once sacralized, emissary victimization constitutes the vital evolutionary default mechanism, which at the threshold of hominization assured the security, the stability, the bonded complicity, unity needed by emergent humankind. It provides the focus and the trigger that were required for the development of culture, of symbolicity and language first of all, then the earliest prohibitions, then with time moral codes, laws and institutions, which enabled society to function by managing their own internally generated violence. This entire process becoming crystallized around sacrificial ritual and mythic stories or identity narratives. As Gifford shows from an impressive range of examples, these stories are unfailingly told in ways which edit out or cover up with a sort of artful artlessness our own participation in founding murder. Think about it. Why would our first human ancestors not sacralize obscurely in dreamlike unknowing the principle that appeared to convert their greatest human peril into a life-opening source of seemingly unlimited quasi-divine possibility? Understand that, and you will understand where the book of Genesis itself, written many thousands of years later, is coming from, how and why it is revelatory and a new departure. It should be clear from this first sense that there's going to be a secondary sense that is latent and sometimes resurgent, which applies still today and affects us all. Founding murder designates the evolutionary legacy transmitted from this first originary practice, which both enabled and pre-programmed our own coming to be. It's the received form of mind, it's the inbuilt logic of group intelligence and action that bonds and binds us together, all unawares, whoever we are. All very interesting, you might say, but really, this whole scenario is pure speculation, isn't it? Lively imagination, even sheer fiction. Where's the field work? The evidence? Well, please look at this. Here, courtesy of National Geographic, is an artist's reconstruction of the world's oldest known temple, discovered and under excavation for the past 10 years or so at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, on the road out of Africa. It's very old indeed, dating from 11.5 millennia ago. That's just after the Great Ice Age, a staggering 7,000 years before the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and more than 6,000 years before our own homegrown Stonehenge. The entire phenomenon is surprising and subversive of long-cherished ideas. It seems well-nigh incredible, for starters, that a monument of this size, ambition and degree of sophistication should have been constructed by roaming bands of hunter-gatherers, united only in the task of that construction and to the end of the rituals performed here. That shock alone has been compared to discovering a jumbo jet entirely constructed with household tools in a suburban garage. The very confident dating it has been possible to make and the incontestable religious function of the structure are just as astounding and even more deeply subversive. It used to be thought by Victorian anthropologists and their 20th century successors that ancient religion was one of the things like writing, effective weapons, commerce, that flowed from settlement and civilization. Somewhere between domesticating animals and putting a man on the moon, human beings invented religion. Not so. That precise stating, that irrefutable function of archaic sacral cultic worship sufficed to prove that religion precedes settlement. And they suggest to the director of excavation, the late Carl Schmidt, that religion is indeed the matrix and the impetus of the entire cultural and civilizational development that followed, exactly as envisaged by Girard, following and adapting the founder of modern sociology, Emile Durkheim. Something else that's arresting and deeply suggestive. The prodigious quantities of arrowheads, spear points, and flint knives found at the site proved beyond question that this temple was also something very much like a weapons factory, associated naturally and inescapably with associated violence and the sacred. How exactly? If we knew that, it would help with another related question which we can resolve only by surmise and deduction. What sacred rituals went on there? What was the earliest archaic sacral worship actually like? Well, look at the design of this temple. Partly this is a liturgical amphitheatre heralding the simpler lines of the amphitheatres of Greek tragedy. It's thought that the common spectators gathered round the earthen banks built up outside the walls, the outside walls, and looked in on the action, while their representatives, the priests and elders, were inside, closer to the sacred space between the T-pillars, at the centre of those concentric circles. But look also at how this liturgical arena is at the same time a massively defended fortress, such as we find later in the gladiatorial arenas of Rome. Look at the low entrance tunnel, the containing walls which keep sacrificial victims in, as well as keeping the people out of the sacred space at the centre between the twin pillars. Another clue, this one pretty decisive. In the refuse pits of bones found at the site have been found enormous quantities of animal bones, some clearly of comestible animals, consumed in great quantities by early Stone Age pilgrims in what are thought to have been carnival-type festivities. But remember that licensed transgression, in Girardian theory, leads up to the solemn climax of ritual blood sacrifice. Its function is to let loose the anarchic instincts and desires that the social order contains and regulates, so that it can then reenact in a dreamlike sort of way the logic of founding murder as a salvational and identity bonding event. So, are there any signs of the solemn climax we might expect from Carnival? Any signs of ritual sacrifice? Well, yes. Other refuse pits show lesser quantities of non-charred bones from non-comestible animals, this time symbolically potent, fearsome, predatory ones. And mingled with these, they show many butchered human bones. Both animal and human sacrifice, it seems, were practiced perhaps in a series of ritual acts in a crescendo of sacrificial violence, which reenacted symbolically the mimetic crisis and its resolution, exorcising all forms of real-life violence. We might take note of other significantly Girardian motif. The fearsome animals depicted are of course really frightening, in an immediate and concrete sense to hunter-gatherers, but they are also demonised, that's to say held to be guilty of all the woes afflicting the community, including violence born of intra-community conflict, and perhaps even the perceived violence suffered from acts of cosmic nature, which must of course have seemed overwhelmingly hostile to Neolithic man emerging from the Great Ice Age. It is in this sense that the goat, which we find also represented on some of the special portal stones, the ones thought to symbolise a communication with the other world, is a goat demon, a demonised victim or scapegoat. Remember the etymology of scapegoat in English? It's as an escapegoat. It helps you escape something that's gripping you and bothering you. Look at the humanised T-pillars, which demarcate the sacred ritual space in the centre. They bear a sculpted representation of the victim stroke God. And perhaps in their very dédoublement, they're splitting, they're doubling up, represent the first changed into the second. The pillars are symbolically half human, half divine. And they declare the obscure dream logic at work in the sacrificial process itself. A dynamic of transformation is represented, which declares the quite unconscious pharmacology Girard has described. Polarity of life forces is here being reversed, symbolically, from negative to positive, from death to life, from disorder to order, from violence to peace. In passing, we may notice the T shape of the pillars. That actually anticipates, from afar, the earliest shape taken in the whole of the Middle East by the cross of crucifixion. The most curious feature of all at this site is that the standing stone rings, whatever their function, must have seemed to the Neolithic pilgrims to lose their virtue or their potency, so that fresh, near identical structures, albeit progressively less elaborate, were over a period of nearly 1,400 years built nearby or else simply on top of previous constructions which were first filled in for the purpose, seemingly in the hope of making good some mysterious yet central deficiency. I quote, every few decades people buried the pillars and put up new stones, a second smaller ring inside the first. Sometimes later they installed a third. Then the whole assemblage would be filled in with debris and an entirely new circle created nearby. The site may have been built, filled in and built again for centuries. That's Charles Mann in National Geographic. In short, the monumental labour early Neolithic man poured into this temple complex was never ending, since each temple had to be constantly improved and even replaced, on average every 70 years. And yet, quote, bewilderingly, the people at Göbekli Tepe got steadily worse at temple building. The earliest rings are the biggest and most sophisticated, technically and artistically. As time went by, pillars became smaller, simpler, and were mounted with less and less care. Finally, the effort seems to have petered out altogether. By 8,200 BC, Göbekli Tepe was all fall and no rise. What's interesting about that? Just this, that this extraordinary singularity requires an explanation. And Girard's theory of violent origins supplies it, elegantly and exactly. It's a perfect fit. Do you see why? The control of violence by emissary victimization, the power of human sacrifice to deliver survival, let alone salvation, is a lie. It's a product of human self-mystification. It does not work. So you have to begin again. Try harder. You have to fill in the hole, displace the temple, construct it over and over again, in an eternal recurrence of effort and expiation, until hope runs out, until the spark dies and the people scatter or perish. That, I think, is the ultimate figure of sense we can discern at the bottom of Girard's sinkhole. Well now, I believe we may have reached a turning point. Like the charioteers in the rather later Roman racing arena, that's some 8,000 or 9,000 years later after this. The racing arena too was traced out around twin pillars. By then separated out, of course, further and become marking stones. Do you remember your Ben-Hur? Chariots would race along one side of the oblong course, turn round the mark, and race back down the other side. think we're now at the turning mark, heading back towards the finishing line, labelled reconciliation. To get there, we have to complete the outline of understanding traced out today, and we do that by following Gifford in his reading of the Judeo-Christian scriptures. We've seen a natural or archaic religion that doesn't work. Now let's see what the Judeo-Christian scriptures do with that inherited situation. And that's what I shall attempt to do in lecture 3 next week. Thank you.